Welcome to our Bible study. We're looking at the book of James. And as I get set up, just want to remind you what we're doing. We're looking at a unit that's entitled The Making of Authentic Faith, Wisdom That Works. And of course, one of the major themes of the book of James is seeking God's wisdom and also a faith that demonstrates itself through works. We went over a number of themes last week as we introduced the book of James. What we're going to do today is pick up right where we left off and continue on with the remainder of the section that deals with trials and temptations. Today's lesson is entitled Overcoming Temptation, and we're going to be looking at James 1:13 to 18. We ended our discussion last week with verse 12, and I want to pick up with verse 12 because, as you'll see in some of your Bibles, verse 12 begins a new section that goes with 13 and 18. Some will put it at the end, although most are going to put it right there at the beginning of verse 13. Some are going to put it right at the end of verses 1 through 11. As I mentioned last week, the the New International Version goes ahead and puts it by itself. And as I've done some research, a number of commentators, regardless of where the translations are going to put that, will put it by itself. But note that there is a kind of link or bridge that's going on between verse 12 and what precedes and what follows. And we want to talk about that. As a background passage, you may want to also consider looking at Hebrews chapter 4, verses 12 to 16, and that'll come into play as we look at our text today. As I said, as always, I'm glad you're joining me for Bible study, and it's always a pleasure to be here with you. I have to admit, there's a lot that I enjoy about teaching, but there's also a lot that I know that I would like to say and don't always have time to. I just hope that, as always, as we go through our lessons together, you are spurred on to study the Word of God even more closely. Go back and read it slowly, and also go back and read it intently. And if I could, I'd want to make you a little bit more accountable, as always. As last week I said, hope that you will read the book of James every week of this study. And if you were to read just one chapter a day for Monday through Friday, you'd be reading the book of James for about 13 times through our lessons together. Well, moving forward real quickly, I just want to point out to you again, as we were talking last week about trials and the various types of trials we have, James is going to conclude, or at least we're going to talk about James concluding with that discussion in chapter 1, verse 12, with the idea of the blessing on those who endure it. But I want to pick up on that text as well moving forward, because I think that as you read the text, you're going to see that what James does in verse 12 is links what's going on between what he just said about trials and what he's going to say about temptations. So let me first read the text, then I'll pull up on the screen a brief outline of what we're going to see as we look through the text. And as always, we'll go through it verse by verse. Let me go ahead and read that to you. I'm reading again from the New King James Version, and it reads this way: "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my brethren, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." Well, all right, as we've looked at that, let's go ahead and take a look at an outline of the text. And we're going to see basically the text is going to break down into two major parts. And as we see those two parts, we're going to see it break down into verses 13 through 15. And then we're going to see it break down into verses 16 through 18. And we'll say something about that breakdown even with verse 16 in a moment. But there are a number of different ways we can title this. And as I was going through this, I created a number of alternate outline items, but I think this will be best for now, and we'll see how that plays out. The first thing we're going to see in verses 13 to 15 is James clarifying for his readers that the origin of temptation is not God. Moving forward in verses 16 through 18, we're going to see that James emphasizes that the origin of good is God. And really, what I'd like to suggest there in the way that he describes this is that you could say it this way: the origin of temptation is not God, but God is the origin of good. So let's go ahead and take a look at this text verse by verse. And as we do that, remember that I'll read part of the text again. We'll walk through it little by little and then discuss some major key elements. If you've been observing, you'll note from last week and even what I just read, James is very rich in metaphors. He has very straightforward language. Obviously, there are a number of imperatives that he gives that are instructions and exhortations for his readers to follow. And of course, we as extension of that will follow his word. But he does so by then giving a lot of metaphors and rich imagery. And some of that requires us to play that out a little bit just to see how we can make application to us. Some of these are going to be rather easy for us to consider. And other times as we read forward, there'll be some challenges. But most of James, when he uses those images and metaphors, we pick right up on them. Well, I know that our outline is going to cover verses 13 to 15 first, and then verses 16 through 18 next, but I do think it's important to pick up on verse 12 again. As I said, it concludes what was just said about trials and the blessing upon those who endure or bear up or are steadfast. Some translations will say be patient. But also I want to point out that while the New King James says temptation there, because he's talking about trials, I do think that's the best way to take that, given the fact also that in that verse he talks about overcoming, which is a word that is used to, or the word endure, which is also a word used earlier in the text. And then the word trial has been used up to this point. And so I think with all that he's doing there, he's concluding. However, one of the things we're going to find is that the word that he uses for trial, that James uses for trial, can also be used as temptation. And what the New King James Version is doing there is picking up on that shift there and then playing that out through the rest of verses 13 to 18. However, I'm in agreement with a number of people that will say that verse 12 probably should start off with the word trial. And then actually, when we read verse 13, there's something else we can do with that. We do see a shift taking place, but I think it's important to note where that shift takes place. What we are seeing, though, is what James is doing in verse 12 is bringing to conclusion what he has brought to us about trials and God giving us the endurance and the wisdom to endure, but then playing that as a way of moving into the final verses of this section. And then as we conclude today, we'll note that he uses a phrase there in verse 18 that's going to propel us even further into the next section. And so while he may not do this all the time, one of the key features that we're going to see in the letter is that he'll conclude one section with one item, and that serves as kind of an intro to the next. What you are going to see then, of course, as you read through the letter, are a number of these themes being repeated throughout the letter. So we're going to note that moving forward. First, again, verses 13 to 15, James says very clearly, the origin of temptation is not God. Now, I didn't show it to you on the screen, but I want to further divide verses 13 to 15 into a statement that James makes from each verse. So he's going to discuss three truths about temptation as we go through the text. First, and it's the heading really, the source of temptation is not God. And James is going to make a very important point about that. Verse 14, the second point, the source of temptation is our desires. And then verse 15, the process of temptation ends in death. And so what he is going to do is write anticipating what his readers may think as they are going through this trial, and he's anticipating the way they might respond to their trials, and he gives an injunction against certain attitudes and actions when they go through these trials. So when trials come and we may face many choices and many decisions, verse 5, James reminded us that we could ask God for wisdom and that he would help us with that. He's a giver of generous gifts. And while it could be wisdom for anything, clearly in the context, we can see that he means wisdom in dealing with our trials and making right decisions. One of those decisions James is going to pick up on is what we believe God is doing with those trials. We've seen in the early verses that God is using that to build our perseverance, to build our faith, to make us mature. But we can also see there's a temptation, if I can use that word now, about thinking of what trials are going to do in our relationship with God. One aspect of that wisdom then is to know the intent of the trial. One temptation, and James is going to pick up on this, is to blame God for the evil motives or with evil motives behind those trials. James is going to be abundantly clear, though, that that is not an option. So let's look at verse 13 again. The source of the temptation is not God. James makes a point to show the reader they need to identify the true source of their temptation. And the first step is to recognize who it is not, and it is not God. For his prohibition, or by his prohibition, James acknowledges that what might occur during a time of trial is to think that God was doing something to make them fail or to make us fail. And part of the temptation then might even be to blame God. So first, he says, when you're going through trial, don't think that God is tempting you. Don't say, God is tempting me. You may be tempted by a number of things. And one of those temptations is to think that God is trying to cause you to fail. Let's read verse 13 again and talk through it. He says very clearly, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. James goes on to say, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Well, as I said in leading up to the reading and going through it again, the New King James Version is going to use the word tempted twice. And it's not totally out of the question, but I think the transition is going to be from the word leading up to the question and then the statement. So again, let me say it this way. I think one way to read this text is to say, let no one say when he is going through a trial, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt himself anyone. It's possible, I think, and there are others that have affirmed me. It's not like I'm going out on a limb and saying this. I'm not being a maverick or a lone ranger in my interpretation here. I think it's possible that what James is saying is when someone is going through a test or a trial, they should not say, I'm being tempted by God. So he's picking up again on that idea of trial from the previous verses and now seeing that that could be misconstrued as a temptation. What he's going to pick up on after that, as we'll see in verse 14, of course, is if there is a focus on temptation, if there's any temptation that might be in play, it's not going to be coming from God. It's going to be coming from somewhere else. So if I can repeat, someone could misconstrue a trial or a test, which God would use for good, as we've seen earlier. He seeks to do those good things. We might seek to consider those trials as if something God were doing to put in the way of us, causing us to fail. But James goes to great lengths and is at pains to show that God is not the source of temptation. He says that God is not the source. He says again, let no man say, I am being tempted from God. And he literally says from God there. It could be translated by God, but the word there, the preposition by, is the word from, meaning God would be the source. If you use the word strictly by, it may be that the source could be something else, but God is the instrument by bringing it. The reality is that they're going all the way back to ultimate causes. James says, don't let anyone say who is going through a trial, I am being tempted from God. He uses as I said, he uses a preposition that refers to ultimate source, regardless of who the agent is. God might be using someone else, maybe their situation, maybe a person, and if that person is thinking it's ultimately God bringing them temptation, James says, call that out. Do not, that is not the case. That is not going to be God. And he gives two interesting reasons why it can't be God bringing the temptation. He says two things. One, God cannot be tempted by evil. The text there is really interesting. It's almost like it says he's untemptable of evil things. The word evil there, it really is plural, and it's the idea of many things that are evil. The word for cannot be tempted is an adjective that's only used here in the New Testament, and likely even more rare that it's not anywhere else in ancient literature. Some suggest that what James is doing is actually making up a word, but he builds on the word for temptation or testing and says that can't happen to God. God cannot be tempted. He's untemptable. He's incapable of being tempted. And of course, the word there is used in the negative connotation because it's further modified by the idea of by evil, or literally of evil things. Now, he's not temptable by or of evil things, plural. And it could mean that he's not tempted to do evil or to be tempted by evil things or evil beings. Let me get to the next point next. And then the question is going to be, how are these two ideas related to one another? And I think there's an interesting way to bring this about. First, again, he says God cannot be tempted by evil, and he does not tempt anyone. Now, that sounds a lot more commonsensical to us than God being incapable of being tempted. But how are these two related? How is it that he's unable to be tempted, and that connects with his not tempting anyone, nor does he tempt anyone, James says? I like to look at it this way. The first statement of being untemptable or not being capable of being tempted is kind of a foundational statement. It's a pre-statement, a pre-step, if you will. Follow along, and I've got someone that will help me make this clear for you. If God could be tempted by evil things, then it follows that one temptation might be to lead others into temptation to sin as well. Let me read that again, then I'll have a quote for you. If God could be tempted by evil things, then it follows that one temptation might be to lead others into temptation to sin as well. What James does is he cuts that right at the root and says this: God in his being is not impacted by temptation either way. Let me get some help from Sophie Laws in her Black's New Testament commentary from a few decades ago. She says this: God cannot be seen as the author of temptation since he himself cannot be tempted. The logic is not immediately obvious. And believe me, when I first read that, I thought the same thing, and I'm just glad others saw the same thing. She says the logic is not immediately obvious. God's imperviousness to temptation could be seen as an aspect of his power. He is impervious because there is no other able to put pressure upon him. In other words, he can't be tempted from outside. And this need not bar his action on men. What must be understood is that temptation is an impulse to sin. And since God is not susceptible to any such desire for evil, he cannot be seen as desiring that it be brought about in man. If he were capable of being tempted, one of the things he could be tempted to do is cause others to sin or tempt them to sin, lead them to try and fall. Let me work in reverse then. If he did tempt anyone to sin, it is because he himself is susceptible to temptation. So James is saying he's not susceptible to temptation, therefore he also does not tempt anyone. Let me read another way of saying this. Since temptation begins with one's desires, as we'll see in a moment, it means those desires must be susceptible to an evil bent. But God's desires are always good and only good all the time. Thus, he is not temptable. It's just not in God's nature to do that. I hope that made some sense to you, and I hope that you follow along. If not, I would encourage you to go back and rewatch that. But I do think it's very important to make some sense of how these two characters or these two qualities of God tie together. He's neither temptable by evil things, and he is not one who tempts others. Let me give you an example then from really a recent study. Many of you have been with me through the summer as we went through the book of Judges. And one of the things that's said in the book of Judges is God allowed the Canaanites to stay in the land when the Israelites did not completely defeat them. But here was why he let that happen. God left the Canaanites in the land to test the Israelites. In other words, to give them an opportunity to approve themselves as faithful, that they could be attested and tried. And I'm picking up on those same words that were used in James, the earlier verses, talking about testing of your faith and being tested and proved in verse 12, for instance. However, here's what happened. They submitted to their own desires and fell into idolatry. Tying in nicely with our own previous study of Book of Judges, I said, what God intended as a test, giving them a chance to prove their faith, Israel turned into a temptation to sin and follow after those gods. But that does not lie at the feet of God. In other words, that they fell into temptation is not on God. He didn't allow the test to occur. He didn't allow the Canaanites to stay in the land to lead them to fall, but to give them an opportunity to approve themselves as faithful. That they were tempted falls on themselves. The Israelites were solely responsible for how they had responded to the Canaanites and their religions among them. And we're going to see that play out in what James gets ready to say in a moment. But even note this, not only were the Israelites themselves responsible, at one point we see an attempt to blame God for this. Remember, one of our last studies was with Gideon. And at one point, Gideon said this in essence, you left us alone. And basically, he said, where were you? And in essence, what's he doing? He's blaming God for their failure, for their falling away. Now, God wouldn't have any of that, of course. In many ways, he says, well, I'm here now. And he showed up to help them. But one of the things James is doing here in verse 13 is saying, you may be tempted in your trial to blame God for being tempting or for tempting you. And James says that is out of the question. That is not going to happen. God is not the source of your being tempted. Verse 14, though, he addresses the second thing we discussed, and that is what the true source of temptation is. James says it's our desires. Verse 14 again reads this way, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Now, some of your translations may say evil desires. The word there we're going to see could be either negative or positive. Here it's clear that it's negative. But here's what we need to look at. One is drawn away by his own desires and is enticed. Now, the way the original reads it is it's going to be something like this. Each one is tempted by his own desires, being drawn away and enticed. What a lot of translations are then going to do is put the idea of by evil desires or by desires at the end and read this way. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own desires. It is interesting, the New King James Version puts the phrase by his own desires between the two participles, being drawn away and being enticed. In the original, it's actually before both of those. But I think it's fitting to make sense of it, you can put it at the end, especially given what the two participles mean, being drawn away or dragged away and enticed. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what we're seeing here is James highlighting very specifically that the source of the temptation is our own desires. It's what's within us and the things that we might crave. Now, the word desires there is a word that can mean lust. It can mean evil desire. It means a strong longing or desire for something, but it doesn't always mean something negative. This is the same word, for instance, at the Lord's Supper, when Jesus in Luke 22 says, I have eagerly desired with great desire to have this meal with you. And it's this word. So it's clearly not the word itself that determines whether it's a positive or a negative. It's actually a neutral word governed by context. What may make it evil or a lust would be either the object that's sought after or the motive for seeking that object. So context is going to determine that. I do think that the King James or the New King James here calling it desires is good, keeping it neutral, but other translations are going to add the word evil there. What James then does is he identifies the action, a word picture describing the action of what the desires do. And it's rather interesting when you think about it. He's using two words there, being enticed and being dragged away or being drawn away, that often are used in terms of hunting, like laying a trap, or with the second word specifically, the word being enticed is a word that was used in the noun form to be a lure that you would put in the water as a trap or as bait for fishing. So one way to look at this is that James putting these two words together draws a picture of our desires out there and then being dragged away by those desires. Instead of our controlling our desires, we allow our desires to control us. And so he says what happens in that instance is we are dragged away, drawn away, and enticed. Now, given the order in which these words are given, they seem kind of backwards. You'd think you'd be lured away and then drawn away or dragged away. What might be going on here is that often happens with word pictures that even we use in our own language. And that is, he might have gotten them backwards, given the fact that it became a stock saying, perhaps, as an image of being drawn away by desires, and such that when someone hears it, they don't think of actually fishing when they hear this idiomatic expression or this metaphor. But if we were to take that kind of literally, I could almost see someone casting out a line of fishing with their lure and then getting it hooked in their back pocket and then being dragged away by their own fishing lure or being caught in their own trap. They have a desire out there and they get trapped. Well, some have suggested that by the time that that James is writing this, the saying just became a saying of its own, and no one's really thinking about the fishing aspect itself, but what the idiomatic expression means. Chris Vlachos, in his exegetical guide to the Greek New Testament, says this. He entitles this section, "Being Hooked by Our Own Bait." We may be making a little bit more of that than others, and I know that your study guide will use the idea of fishing in there as well. But here's what some have suggested, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. While such language was used in Jewish literature to some extent, some scholars, like Douglas Moo in his commentary, suggest that by James' day, the meaning of the metaphor would have been known regardless of its roots in fishing. In other words, the point is they would know what the meaning of the word is, even if they don't know the root or the origin of it. So let me give you an example. It's a dark example, I know, but it's one that's been used in recent years for a number of different reasons. It's like when someone says, "You've been drinking the Kool-Aid," or "You drank the Kool-Aid, didn't you?" We all know what it means. It means that you have been enticed, or you have been fooled, you have been deceived into following some wrong ideology or going down the wrong path. You've been convinced of something that's not true. Most people know what the metaphor means. They don't all know that it ultimately came from what happened in Jim Jones's cult in the late 1970s, when he gathered a bunch of people with him in South America and then had them all drink Kool-Aid with cyanide in it, and they all died. In other words, they gave in to a cult-like leader, or in this case, a real cult leader. We know what it means to drink the Kool-Aid, even though we may not know where it originated from. Many suggest James is using a metaphor that they're very familiar with, and at that point, it's just knowing about being enticed without recognizing that it's a hunting or a fishing term. The point is this. James makes very clear the temptation comes from within. And if the temptation comes from within, then it's an internal matter. Don't blame God if you're being tempted in your trial. If you're being tempted in your trial, you need to understand that temptation is your own desire. You're being pulled by a specific desire. Now, what we'll think about at the end of our lesson is what trials we may be going through and what temptations we may be facing in those trials. What are we desiring that may lead us to sin? The point that James makes here is that the temptation comes from within. And I'll just say briefly here, if the problem is from within, then the solution to overcoming temptation is also internal. So he first says that God is not the source of temptation. He says, secondly, that the source of temptation is our desire. And it's pretty violent if you think about it. Being enticed, it's deceiving. It's being enticed and drug away. But in verse 15, he then says the process of temptation ends in death. So there's first the warning against wrongly attributing the temptation. Then there's also the warning to be aware of where that temptation could go. Here's what he says. When desire has conceived, so it starts with our desires being enticed and drug away. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth or brings forth death. Now, as you read those words, of course, you want to note the contrast between the series of events that occur here and the series that is given earlier when James talks about what the function of trials are. Remember, the functions of the function of trials is to produce endurance, and endurance, when it matures, produces or comes fully grown or reaches its final its goal. It makes you mature. So there is a process that takes place. What James is saying is, if you're treating your trial like a temptation to sin, then be careful, because here's what's happened. Here's what's going to happen. That desire is going to conceive and give birth to sin. Sin is going to then grow and mature to the point where it brings forth death. And what I'm doing there is picking up on the two words giving birth and bringing forth. They're both actually two different words for the idea of giving birth. That's going to be played out later when we look and see what God does on our behalf. But you see a progression there. We see a conception, then a birth, then a growing, and then death. It will give birth, and it will give birth to death. So you see that metaphor from conception to birth to maturation and ultimately to death. We've already mentioned the reverse that you see, or the different approach of what going through trials would mean if we approach them in the right way, seeking perseverance or steadfastness. which will lead to maturity, which will lead to our own maturity. Another example might be in the series that you see in Romans chapter 6, verse 23, where it says the wages of sin is death. James points out in these verses that sin leads to death. He's going to say in a moment, though, in verses 16 to 18, the gift of God is eternal life. So God gives good gifts and makes us a first fruit. We'll see where that plays in the idea of giving birth in a moment. Another illustration you might find from the Old Testament is the warning against the enticing woman in the early chapters of the book of Proverbs, and going after and being enticed by the woman, that will lead to death. You can see a number of other series that occur in the New Testament. You may be able to think of what goes on in 1 Peter and other places. You also go back and look at Romans chapter 1 or 5, verses 1 to 5, and the role that suffering can do in leading us to a stronger faith as well. Here, James is saying all of this, if misconstrued as an intent by God to lead us astray and lead us to sin, we need to get that thought out of our mind, rightly identify ourselves as the source of the temptation, and then knowing where temptation will go, it's in our minds and in our thoughts and dealing with our desires that we stop it. A couple of observations, though, as we move forward into the next section. It has to do with the title of our lesson. It's entitled Overcoming Temptation. And the other thing is that in both the teacher guide and the student guide, there's a lot of talk about what Satan does in tempting us. So I want to bring that in here now. And then while giving some kind of pushback on it, also then give some affirmation. As I said, the lesson is entitled Overcoming Temptation. But truth be told, this passage doesn't say anything about how to overcome temptation. He simply identifies the source of temptation and warns of the direction of temptation. So by virtue of indicating both the source of temptation and the path from temptation to sin to death, what James is doing is giving us a preemptive warning about and motivation against sin. So think about what I said a moment ago when I said, if the temptation is from within, then the solution to the temptation is from within. The temptation resides within, and that's the place to stop as well, no matter how hard it is to do. It should also be noted that by being tempted, it is not a sin. It's not a sin to be tempted. Jesus was tempted. We know that Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, was tempted by the devil. We also know that the letter to the Hebrews, which is our background passage, the letter to the Hebrews mentions that Jesus was tempted, and in all ways like we were, and yet without sin. At no point does the letter to the Hebrews indicate that Jesus did anything wrong by being tempted. It's about where that temptation is going, or what we do with that temptation. By James saying then where temptation begins in its potential and result, he indicates where it can stop before temptation becomes sin. Second, and I hinted at this already with Jesus being tempted by the devil, the second observation is this: Satan is not mentioned in this text. When James is talking about the temptation, he's indicating it's our desires. We're dragged away. Now, that being dragged away might be something Satan can use with our desires, but it never says that in this text. It says we are dragged or drawn and enticed by our desires. However, even though Satan is not mentioned in this text, in these verses, it's not to say that he's not involved. After all, he is the tempter. He is one who tempted Jesus. We see that he's one that tempts throughout the Gospels. We do know of his work in temptation throughout the New Testament. In fact, later on, one of the things James is going to say is that we need to resist Satan. Jesus did not sin even though he was tempted, as we see in Hebrews chapter 4, 12 through 16. But I will say this: we do know of the serpent tempting. We know of the role that Satan played in 2 Chronicles. We know of the role that Satan played in the book of Job with God's oversight. I'll say it that way. But certainly, Satan's intent was to get Job to curse God. We do know then that while we have to keep guard of our desires, we also need to be aware that Satan may seek to use our desires against us. And we do want to watch out for that. So I don't want to totally denounce the idea of overcoming temptation, even though this text doesn't say how to overcome it. By giving a preemptive call to where our temptations come from and where they're going to go, that's a word of warning in advance to deal with the temptation in the moment, in the act of having the desire, and then be on guard so that Satan does not use that against us. So a few verses now talking about what God is not the source of. He is not the source or the origin of our temptation. And I think it's interesting. What James is going to do here in a moment is he's going to use another verse, or at least a saying that we divide into a verse, that could either be the conclusion of what he just said or the beginning of what he's about to say. And it's really probably the genius of James at this point, where he's using a phrase that can do both. And let's talk about that. So in verses 16 to 18, the first thing he says is, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Do not be deceived. The question is, in what way do not be deceived? Sophie Laws, in her commentary again, she translates this phrase, make no mistake. The question is, make no mistake about what? Is James saying don't be deceived with regard to what he just said? And that makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that when he says God is not the origin of temptation, and your desires are the source of your temptation, don't be deceived. In other words, don't be deceived in thinking God is the source of your temptation. It dovetails perfectly with what he says at the beginning of verse 13. Let no man, when he is being tested, say, I am being tempted by God. It could also, however, be an injunction about not being deceived with regard to who God really is. And as a result, it can kind of work both ways. You see this phrase, do not be deceived, in a few places. One, you see it in 1 Corinthians 6:9. You also see it in 1 Corinthians 15:33, and again in Galatians 6:7, where that phrase is used, where it does introduce something that follows. And so that might be, now Paul is writing, after James has written this letter. In each of those cases, he is introducing what is to follow that they should not be deceived about. But in each of those instances, what follows is to not be deceived by something negative. And what we see in James here is not being deceived, and then he goes on to say something positive. However, when you dig deeper, there is those that suggest that, generally speaking, whenever James uses the phrase brothers and sisters, or my beloved brothers or believers, he then is using that vocative or that direct address to then talk about something that follows. James could be doing both. Let's not be deceived about what God is or who God is. In fact, knowing that it could apply to both, he could say, don't think that God is tempting me. God is the source of all good. Don't be deceived. He could have put that last. Putting it in the middle kind of ends one and begins another. James readers then need to be careful not to be deceived, and they need to not be deceived about God being a possible tempter. They also need to not be deceived so that they recognize who God really is. Let me work through this. The question is, would James's readers be deceived in thinking good gifts come from another source from God? So if it follows, if what he's doing is dealing with not being deceived about what follows, he goes on in those verses to say that as he reads through that, as we'll read in a moment, he goes on to talk about God as the source of all things good. If God is the source of all things good, then when they receive good, might they be deceived in thinking that good comes from somewhere else? I mean, if they could be wrongly in their, if they can think wrongly about the origin of their temptation, could they be wrong in their thought about the origin of good things? It's a possibility. When you're reading a text like this, and we read really deeply and closely, we want to see how closely everything ties together and what the flow of thought is. It's very possible. So James could be doing both. For all practical purposes, though, knowing he's already stated that God is not the tempter, he could have just stopped there. Do not be deceived, and then moved on. Rather, what he does is, after he's already said what God is not, now he goes on to remind them of what God is. So let's talk about that. Even though he could say just stop right there and then move on to another topic, he then continues on. So let's go ahead and look at that. Verse 17 and 18, he says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. I mentioned earlier in our lesson that James uses a lot of imagery and metaphor, and he's doing that here. First, he's talking about the good gift and perfect gift from above, and then he goes on to refer to God as the Father of lights and says that in God there is no variation or shadow of turning, which is picking up on the idea of light, of course. Notice that he says there are two things here, and the question is, why does he use two different phrases? He says every good gift And the word gift there is like the act of giving, every act of giving, every good act of giving, and then every perfect gift. So he repeats the word gift with a different form of it. It's a different word altogether, but it's the word gift. And then he's heightened the word from good to perfect. What is James doing there? Is there any significance in that repetition? Well, by such repetition, it highlights the comprehensive nature. Any good act of giving to you and every good gift that you receive clearly comes from God. And it sounds very similar to what Jesus says about God bringing the good rains on the wicked and the just, that all these things that we know that are good come from God. What it does is it connects also with what James has said earlier about trials, that if you lack wisdom, ask of God, he gives generously and without reproach. The idea of giving generously then ties in here with God as the source of every perfect gift, every good giving. So we see that word coming together. Rather than being the tempter, God is the one who gives good gifts. When he uses the word perfect, then there's another tie-in with what was said earlier in the chapter. And when he says perfect gift, that's a clear tie-in to the idea of being perfect and mature, meaning the faith is perfected and the individual comes to maturity as well. So we see he's using double language here to make some of the same statements. He's used double language and he says being dragged away and enticed. It's really a double image of meaning one thing. Here, every good giving and every perfect gift is all tied together as one act and demonstrate God is the sole provider of all things that are good. Then he goes on to describe two more things. Where do these good things come from? They are from above. And it's going to be important we hear that. From above, coming down from the Father of lights. He's using a word there that directly contrasts what James said earlier, that temptations do not come from God. Good things come from God. So what he's doing is he's contrasting the notion of the source of temptation with the source of goodness. God is not the source of temptation. He's the source of all things good. He goes on to describe God then as the Father of lights. So from above, coming down, we see he is called the Father of lights. And then he's also one in whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. And that speaks to his role as creator and one who is consistent. First, Father of lights. He's creator. He's created all that is. He's created all the heavenly lights, all the heavenly beings. Sometimes that's referring to heavenly beings. I think when you see lights there, it may be the stars and the sun and the moon and all of those things. But that means he's creator over all things. As light, he also does not vary in shadow. The idea of not varying in shadow may speak to the fact that as we see the moon go through its phases, it's got shadows that change. We also know that obviously when the sun goes, well, when the earth rotates on its axis, the shadows change based on where the sun is in our view. But also you note that because of the tilt of the earth and going around the sun, that the shadows change direction from solstice to solstice. And so a lot of what's going on there could be referencing that. Regardless of where all of that is going, what James is saying is God is not like that. He is the creator of all things. And unlike these other lesser lights, he does not bring shadow. He does not change. Remember the song, Great is Thy Faithfulness? It's from this passage where you get the line in the song where it says, there is no shadow of turning with thee. He gets it straight from this. By saying that God is the Father of lights in whom there is no variation or shadow of turning, he is saying that he is creator and he is constant, he is consistent, he is faithful. And certainly with no variation, he is not going to waver like the man who doubts in his trials. So you see more contrast there. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Wonderful song. This emphasizes then again, God is the Father of creation. And his last comment then about not wavering and there being no shadow of turning, his comment about being Father then transitions to verse 18, where he becomes Father of people. Verse 18, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Well, let's break this down a little bit first. Literally, it says willing, meaning out of his willing, because he willed it or after he willed it or on the basis of his will, he brought us forth. So it's on his own will, having willed, literally. Again, the contrast that with the failure and deception of our own desires. He has a will different from our desires. Out of his will, he does what? He brings us forth. Now, first, of course, we talked about God being the creator, the father of lights, but now he's talking about being creator or bringing forth individuals. But I also want to see the contrast between his bringing forth us by the word of truth, contrary to how our desires conceive, birth sin, and bring forth death. What's the contrast? Our sin will lead to death. Or bring forth death. He brings forth us into life. The means that he does it, of course, is by the word of truth. And many suggest that that's a reference to the gospel. You'll see that phrase used similarly in Ephesians 1:13, Colossians 1:5, 2 Timothy 2:15, and to some extent, 2 Corinthians 6:7. But the idea there is that we hear the gospel, and it's the word of truth, and it's by means of that that he brings us forth. He births us. And of course, you can think of what Paul says in Romans, that is by you're saved by faith, and that faith comes through the hearing. And so we have that. But notice also it's a gift. We said he brought us forth. It literally is he gave birth. Notice that concept, contrast between our desires giving birth and his giving birth to us. For what purpose? It says out of his will, he brought us forth. So he gave us life. And then he did it by the word of truth for this purpose, unto this end, literally. And that is that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creation. Now, this is a metaphor that sometimes may be taken as chronological. Could be that what he's talking about is that those he's writing to are a first fruits. They were brought into faith by the word of truth, that they can be a first fruits, meaning others will follow to believe as well. And certainly if that's the case, then it's very important that they bear up under trial, because if they fail in their trials, then the very Christian faith could be at stake. If they don't persevere, then Christianity could possibly die out. Now, I'm pushing the limits there a little bit, but what I'm also pointing out is that it could mean that he's talking about humans as the first fruit of all creation, the pinnacle of creation, but it could be also, and I think more likely, he's talking about believers being brought forth by the word of truth, by the gospel, to be a kind of first fruits. And that is, they are just the beginning. They are what God had and desired for all humans to be, and that is in relationship with him. So we do see a word like that used among Jewish believers or Jewish individuals earlier. And now Paul or James is doing similar to what Peter does later in his letter, and he's applying Old Testament language to New Testament believers. And it's also similar to what you see Paul doing in Romans when he talks about that the gospel was given for the Jew first, then for the Gentile. So they are a kind of first fruits. So James is kind of pulling this all together as Jewish believers in Christ are being addressed here, and how they are then going to be examples, if you will, to future generations. What he's saying then is, as first fruits, we become what God desires of us. And that ties back into what he says earlier when he talks about the goal of our trials. Having then persevered through our trials, there is moving forward. There is the opportunity to continue to serve God and avoid our temptations. Since this is the case, it's all the more reason not to think that it's God who is tempting them to sin. God would not do anything that would cause the conclusion or the end of the Christian faith, because that would mean the gospel is not being preached. It's not God's purpose in their trials that they fall away. It's his purpose that they mature. If they fall away, then that defeats his purpose. It would run counter to his own purpose of seeking to redeem the world. Now, it could be James that is still thinking in terms of trials from the beginning, so that what appear to be and can be applied as a general truth really do tie back in to that theme. And that's why many times you're going to see verses 2 through 18 all tie together. There is a transition from trials, and James's focus on trials, to the concern that some might treat these trials as temptations. Temptations do come, but when they do, we need to recognize their source. And so what we need to recognize in that regard is stop our thinking in the midst of thinking God is tempting us, recognizing that our own thoughts lead us into temptation. And as a result, we need to stop it there. Of the good and perfect gifts God gives then, birthing us through the word of truth to be the first fruits is his good, perfect gift. God would not bring death to us. He wants to bring life to us. What are some concluding thoughts? How do we respond to trials? And again, tying the first part of the chapter in with this part as well. First, of course, we do what he says in James 1:2. Count it all joy when encountering various kinds of trials. However, verse 13, do not say God is tempting you. In our trials, we may be tempted to sin. And in that moment, do not think that it's God who is tempting. As giver of good gifts, and that would include wisdom to deal with our trials, even the trials can be good. God means it for good. Think of what we saw in Joseph in the book of Genesis when he confronts his brothers, and they're concerned that he's going to punish them now that their father is dead. In chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph can look at his brothers and say, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. He went through a trial. And we know not only in the life of Joseph did it all turn out well, but it turned out for the saving of many, as he would say. But also think about Paul's words in Romans 8:28 and following, where he talks about God working in all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. There are going to be struggles that we face. God is seeking to bring good out of it. As we said last week, we can say it here, we won't always know that goodness. We may not learn what that good cause or purpose is until sometime later, but we can always be confident that never is God trying to cause us to fall away or sin. He's trying to build us up. Authentic faith, theme of our unit this summer or this fall. Authentic faith will be characterized by a proper understanding of trials and proper response to trials. Maturing faith will understand that any temptations to sin as a result of enduring trials lies within our own desires and not in God. So we need to check our desires and keep them in check so we don't sin. And I know it's easier said than done. Final reflection then, what kinds of things might we be tempted to do when we face trials? You can list a bunch of trials that you've been going through, or you are going through now. There are many that are going through sickness. There are many going through a series of joblessness. There are many who are going through loved ones being sick. There are any number of trials that we're facing. We're facing persecution in many parts of the world. What are the temptations to sin that result from our trials? What are we tempted to do sometimes in our trials, maybe to alleviate the trial? We need to recognize that that is not God leading us to sin. What kinds of things might we be tempted to do when facing trials? The key thought here is that we go through trials, which God intends to lead to our perseverance, but in the trial, we might be tempted to do wrong. Whatever your temptations you're facing today, and I speak to myself at this point, whatever trials you are facing, which lead you to be tempted to sin, take them to God, seek his wisdom and all his goodness, and he will provide a way for you. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word from James, who speaks directly at us. We know that he wrote in an ancient time, according to our perspective, but he speaks words through your inspiration that apply to us today. For ever since these words were written, we've dealt with persecution, we've dealt with trials, we've dealt with difficulties, and many times we've responded variously to those trials. In a moment of maturity, we are able to look and see and anticipate what good you're going to bring. But in a time of weakness, in a time when we are drawn away by our desires, we end up doing something that we know is counter to your will, and we sin. And as James says, that sin ends up leading to death. Obviously, it could be a literal death, but it can also be a spiritual death. If anything, in our relationship with you, there is a sense of a stunting of our growth when we are failing to keep in line with your will. I just pray right now, Father, for wisdom for us. I pray helping our eyes to be set on you as the Father of lights, knowing that we can trust in you and not having any variation in you, and that you are the giver of all good gifts. And that's a reason for us to worship you. I do pray daily you help us to endure, mature us in the process, and may we continue to give you honor, praise, and glory. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, let's take a quick look at next week's lesson. What we're going to see in next week's lessons, we're going to be looking at the rest of the chapter. So we're going to be looking at verses 19 to 27. And as we look at verses 19 to 27, we're going to note a title that's interesting. Just do it. What's going to happen is, as we transition from the word of truth in verse 18, one of the things that James is going to do is now talk to us about the need in order to follow the word of truth. It's not enough just to hear the word of truth. We need to do the word of truth. So he's done this before. He picks up on a word or a phrase, and then he builds on to the next topic. Hope that you'll be with us to do this again. Read James, keep reading it, keep studying it, review it, and note that he does speak to us, and all that he will push back against us that really hits hard at times. Notice the language that he uses for his readers that apply to us. He calls us beloved brothers. There's an affection there that he has for his readers, and that shines through in his affection for us and God's affection for us as well. I hope that you'll have a good week. And until our next study, I do, as always, pray that you will be well and that you will be blessed.